"Ma'am, you don't belong here. We're going to need to see some ID. Step away from the aircraft." News of Kayla Monroe's mistreatment did more than just trend on social media. It became a catalyst. In the months that followed, private aviation companies scrambled to audit their internal practices. CEOs began to release diversity statements overnight. Jet terminals previously reserved for the wealthy elite were suddenly under scrutiny, not for security breaches, but for their silent biases. But for Kayla, it was never about forcing apologies. It was about forcing change. She knew systemic problems couldn't be corrected with press releases or carefully worded statements. So she launched a legal task force, privately funded through her own wealth, specifically targeting racial discrimination in elite service sectors: aviation, hospitality, financial management. Her mission: expose the unspoken gatekeeping that still persisted behind wealth, connections, and privilege. The group reviewed over 200 complaints submitted within 30 days of its founding. Disturbing patterns emerged. Black travelers denied entry into private lounges. Wealthy black women followed around in luxury boutiques. Elite resorts losing reservations at the last minute. It wasn't just Kayla's story. It was everyone's. She gave those stories a voice, amplified them through her platform, presented them before lawmakers, and connected survivors with legal resources. She made it impossible to ignore. And the result? Congressional hearings. Civil rights organizations taking renewed interest. Even a few federal investigations quietly opened against companies too arrogant to clean up their own messes. Meanwhile, the staff involved in Kayla's wrongful detainment completely fired. Not just the guards. Several upper-level managers who had failed to respond properly were dismissed. One tried to sue the company for wrongful termination. The judge threw it out. The statement from the judge was sharp and clear. Disrespect is not a job description. Bias is not a defense. Ignorance is not immunity. Kayla didn't publicly comment on those firings. She didn't need to. The message was clear. Accountability had finally arrived. And with it came a wave of empowerment. Young black professionals began filming their first-class flights, proudly documenting their presence in spaces that once rejected them. Luxury brands that had long remained silent began reaching out, not just for partnerships, but for education. Kayla refused most of them. She wasn't interested in performative inclusion. She was interested in transformation. And while her public presence grew, she never lost sight of her roots. She frequently returned to her hometown, quietly funding after-school programs, tech labs, community health clinics. Not for credit, not for praise, but to make sure the next Kayla wouldn't have to fight the same battles she did. Because deep down, she knew what it felt like to walk into a room and be seen as less, to be doubted, to be handcuffed. Even when you owned the jet, even when your name was written on the sky. There was a moment, nearly a year after the incident, when Kayla was interviewed on a major news program. The host, clearly expecting a dramatic, emotional retelling, leaned in and asked, "What did it feel like, that moment they put the cuffs on you?" Kayla didn't blink. She looked directly into the camera and answered. It felt like confirmation that everything I suspected, everything I knew about how black people are treated, even when we've done everything right, was real. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't imagined. It was proven. And I decided right then, in those cuffs, that they wouldn't get to define that moment. I would. That clip went viral, not because of the words, but because of the truth behind them. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just told the truth. And people couldn't look away. After that, the incident stopped being just a headline. It became part of a movement. Schools began using her story in business ethics and social justice courses. A documentary filmmaker optioned the rights to tell the full story of what happened that day on the tarmac. It was called Boarding Power. Streaming platforms fought over it. Hollywood actors reached out wanting to play Kayla. She turned most of it down because this wasn't a movie to her. It was her life. And while others saw drama and profit, she saw purpose. She kept her focus on changing systems, not headlines. And it worked. Her aviation company grew by 40% in less than 2 years. a new line of luxury private terminals designed by Black architects, staffed with a fully trained, diversity-certified workforce, open in 5 cities. Her company's slogan, luxury with respect. But even as she succeeded, Kayla never forgot how fragile it all was, how quickly you could be reminded that your wealth doesn't shield you from being seen as a threat. So she never stopped telling the story. Every time a young Black girl approached her and asked how she became a billionaire, she told them the truth, because they told me I couldn't, and because I knew they'd try to stop me, even when I did. And when they asked about the cuffs, she smiled. That was the day they handed me my platform. They just didn't know it. The story might have begun on a runway, in the cruel irony of a woman being stopped at the threshold of what she already owned. But it didn't end there. Kayla Monroe became a symbol, but more importantly, she became a strategist behind a movement that reached far beyond her own name. After the cuffs came off, and after the staff were dismissed, what followed wasn't just a media storm. It was a recalibration of accountability across an entire sector. Her incident wasn't treated as an isolated blunder. It was evidence of a deeply ingrained culture of profiling, entitlement, and corporate indifference. For the first time in a long time, people paid attention. Kayla didn't bask in the attention. She dissected it. She studied how outrage moved, how public memory could fade, and how corporations banked on short news cycles to escape responsibility. So she changed the cycle. She funded independent investigations into racial disparities in executive air travel. She pressured insurance companies to change how they evaluated racial bias claims. She created checklists for how luxury service providers could actually deliver equity, not just pretend to. Meanwhile, the guards who had handcuffed her never found work in their field again. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And Kayla didn't apologize for it, because for too long, people like her have been asked to endure, to smile through humiliation, to de-escalate their own degradation, to be gracious in the face of disrespect. She was done with that, and so was the world that watched her stand her ground. But even amid this massive reckoning, Kayla remained a woman who had built her fortune from grit. She kept her inner circle tight. She doubled her mentorship programs for young Black entrepreneurs. She visited HBCUs and spoke in hushed, powerful tones about preparation, ownership, and being underestimated. At a panel event in New York City, one attendee stood and asked, "What would you say to the girl you were at 18? Kayla didn't hesitate. That people will try to limit you with their imagination, that they'll look at your skin, your hair, your posture, and decide what rooms you're allowed to walk into. And when you walk in anyway, they'll try to pretend they don't see you. Then, when they can't ignore you, they'll try to put you in handcuffs. But none of that matters if you've already decided who you are, if you've already owned yourself." The room stood still, silent. Then it erupted in applause. Not because of showmanship, but because she just cracked open a truth so many carried but hadn't yet spoken. Meanwhile, the private aviation company that had subcontracted the guards who detained her, they folded within a year. Investors pulled out, reputations shattered. A once thriving elite enterprise, now just another cautionary tale of arrogance unchecked and racism unchallenged. Kayla didn't dance on their downfall. She didn't post about it. She didn't need to, because her life had already moved forward. She launched a nonprofit called Altitude, a leadership incubator for underrepresented youth seeking careers in aerospace, aviation, and executive logistics. What they provided wasn't just scholarships. It was access, mentorship, network, flights, literal flights. Because Kayla understood something profound, that the sky wasn't the limit. It was just the beginning. She started flying students out to visit her terminals, letting them step foot on the jets, ask questions, dream without borders. And for the first time in many of their lives, they saw themselves reflected in places they never imagined belonging. One student, a 17-year-old girl from Detroit, told a journalist, "When I saw her plane, I knew what I wanted to become. And when I saw her walk off it, I knew it was possible." That was Kayla's power. Not just breaking through, but holding the door open. And yet, for all her accomplishments, she remained incredibly private. She rarely gave interviews, never chased press, never needed validation from the industries that once overlooked her, because she didn't build her empire for applause. She built it because she knew what the world looked like when black girls weren't allowed to dream, and she was determined to change that. Even years later, when people still whisper about that day on the tarmac, Kayla refused to let it define her. She once said in a speech, "They'll always remember the cuffs. Let them, because what they won't forget is that I still boarded that plane." That quote now sits etched into the wall of the Altitude headquarters, a reminder that pain can be power, and power, when guided by purpose, can rebuild the very world that tried to break you. And while the staff who made that fateful mistake were long gone and the corporate fallout had settled, the deeper impact of that moment still echoed, not just in boardrooms, not just in policies, but in people, in every young entrepreneur who believed their skin was a barrier to entry, in every woman who stood taller after hearing Kayla's story, in every passenger who no longer feared being seen as a threat when all they wanted was to fly. Kayla's story didn't need embellishment. It didn't need dramatization, because the truth was powerful enough. She was the billionaire they tried to humiliate. She was the one they handcuffed. And she became the name they could never erase. Not from the manifest, not from the headlines, and not from history. Years passed, but the memory of that day never faded from Kayla Monroe's mind. Not because it haunted her, but because it defined a turning point. It was the moment when silence was no longer acceptable. The cuffs, cold against her wrists, had become a metaphor for restrictions the world tried to place on people who looked like her. But Kayla turned that metaphor into movement, and movement into progress. And even though she had access, wealth, and influence now beyond what most could imagine, she never abandoned the message behind her success. That respect shouldn't have to be earned. It should be guaranteed. Because dignity isn't a reward. It's a right. She became a figure who lived between two realities. A billionaire who could negotiate contracts in private jet lounges, and a black woman who knew that even her wealth couldn't always protect her from being treated like a suspect. But instead of hiding her pain, she weaponized it. She didn't just change the narrative, she rewrote the script. She created scholarships for aspiring pilots from marginalized backgrounds, many of whom had never even been on a plane. Her company began sponsoring licensing programs for black women in aviation engineering. Her brand became synonymous with not only excellence, but equity. And then, quietly, something else began to shift. Wealthy black families began sharing their own stories of mistreatment at hotels and retail during travel. The veil was lifted. The lie that money could shield you from racism had been exposed for what it always was, a convenient illusion. And every time someone spoke out, Kayla's name was whispered in reverence. She was the one who'd taken the first bullet, the one who stood in front of the camera with iron in her voice and refused to flinch, the one who had something to lose, but risked it anyway. She was no longer just an entrepreneur. She was a shield, a sword, a signal flare, and the story of her confrontation with her own security, on her own jet, became not just a moment in time, but a permanent entry in the cultural memory of a generation. She was invited to testify before Congress to speak on the reality of unconscious bias in federal contracts and corporate hiring. She didn't sugarcoat a word. Racism isn't just loud, it's procedural. It's written into manuals, embedded in assumptions, protected by policies. And it's time we stop acting like professionalism can exist without accountability. Lawmakers called her speech electrifying. Critics called it confrontational. But the public? They called it necessary. Because for once, someone wasn't asking nicely. She was demanding justice. But perhaps her greatest act came not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in how she chose to treat the young guards who had once wronged her. One of them, years after the incident, wrote to her. He was in a rehab program for military veterans. He apologized, not as an employee hoping for redemption, but as a man who'd been taught the wrong things and was finally beginning to unlearn them. Kayla didn't respond publicly, but quietly. She made sure he received access to therapy, housing, and a job interview at a local logistics firm she funded, because she believed in consequences, but not in vengeance. She believed in restoration when it was earned, Her legacy wasn't built on retribution. It was built on standards, on holding people and institutions to a higher one. And the world took note. Kayla Monroe became a case study in multiple business schools, not for being rich, but for being right, for standing tall when it would have been easier to disappear, for choosing justice over image, for knowing that visibility wasn't enough. Impact was the goal. Her company, it expanded internationally. Her nonprofit, it tripled in size. Her face, featured in a permanent exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, titled Unapologetic, the New Vanguard. But when asked what achievement she was most proud of, Kayla gave a surprising answer. She said it wasn't the business, or the buildings, or the balance sheets. It was the moment I walked back onto that jet, after they uncuffed me, head high, no fear, no shame, because that was the moment I took back the narrative, and the moment I knew they could never take my dignity again. And that's where her story finds its strength, not in injustice, but in the insistence on rising in spite of it. She was handcuffed for boarding what she owned, and now she owns the story, owns the skies, owns the legacy. And for every Black woman watching, every young person told they were too loud, too ambitious, too unapologetic, Kayla Monroe became the proof that no matter what systems try to stop you, they couldn't cancel what was already destined. This wasn't just a story of one woman versus a few guards. It was the truth versus the lie. And the truth won. Like my video and subscribe my channel for more daily videos.